Are you looking for an experience that will grow your teenagers' faith, increase their leadership skills, and teach them the discernment to engage with the world all around them, all while taking them on the adventure of a lifetime? I mean, who isn't looking for that? If your teenager loves fun, adventure, and wants to grow in their faith and leadership this summer, then send them to Excel's Summer Leadership Camp. Excel's Summer Leadership Camp is a 12-day experience for passionate young leaders looking to discover God's truth, to discern wisely, and live wholeheartedly. Your teenager will embark on a transformative journey in the Blue Ridge Mountains, where they'll build lasting friendships in the context of community, embark on thrilling adventures like camping, rock climbing, whitewater rafting, and they will receive expert training and certifications in categories like CPR and wilderness first aid. Each aspect of the camp is woven together to help them learn to discover truth, to discern wisely, and take godly action in the context of real-life situations. To learn more or begin an application, go to theexcelcamp.org. That's theexcelcamp.org. Hurry, because summer is just around the corner.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Reclamation Podcast, where our goal is to help you reclaim good practices for faith and life. The Reclamation Podcast is brought to you by the Spirit and Truth Podcast Network. For more information on Spirit and Truth, check out their ministry page at spiritandtruth.life. Hey everybody, if we haven't met yet, my name is Tony, and this is episode 108 of the podcast. I get to sit down with author and grief expert Mark Negley. Mark and I talk about ways to experience grief, about how to appreciate where you are, and talks a great deal about the voice of God and how to kind of live in the tension of grief and faith and promise. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. He gives some really practical advice to anyone who's suffering from grief. And based off of his research, there are 300 million of us that are impacted by a loss. If you do enjoy this episode, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to podcasts, share this episode with a friend, maybe a grieving friend, and leave a rating or review on iTunes. It does go a long way to help people find the podcast whenever they're looking for whatever the topic may be. So your rating or review really does make a difference. Now, if you want to learn more about what Mark said, if you want to find out some more details, we have full show notes at reclamationpodcast.com. Reclamationpodcast.com. All of the show notes are listed there, plus links, anything that we talk about in the episode are all listed on that website. So without any further ado, here's my conversation with Mark. Thankful for all you guys. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm here today with author, speaker, and CEO, right? Mark Negley. Mark, thanks so much for being here today.
Hey, Tony. A pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, how does someone become a grief expert? Because as I was looking at a lot of your writing, I think I don't think that's a title many people want to get. Tell us a little bit about your story. How did you get to this place where you really have dove headfirst into the topic of grief?
Well, there's a couple of different ways I think that happens, right? Number one is the traditional route where people go to school, become psychologists, psychiatrists, and so forth. I think those in seminary who have become pastors, chaplains, and so forth, grief counseling and supporting others is an inherent part of that role, a tough part of it, but an inherent part of it. The third way is that you go through it yourself and you have a passion that, God inspires in you. And that was my path. And as I say in the book I've written on this, and as we talk about this quite frequently, I'm not a rabbi. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a self-proclaimed religious healer or teacher. I'm not a psychiatrist, psychologist, or doctor. I'm a guy who's been through the gauntlet of life and has learned a great deal about that. And God gave me a little gift that he asked me to share with people that I'm happy to share with you in this discussion.
Yeah. The resource that you've come out with, Survive, Alive, Thrive, is all about this revolutionary model for understanding recovery from grief. Right. And it's told through this very personal and intimate idea of your gauntlet. Can you kind of take us through what you experienced?
Sure. And I would want to say to start with that as we jump into some of the tough stuff that I've been through, that is the foundation of what led me down this path, is that today I am a joy-filled, happy guy, right? Yeah. I am more blessed than I certainly deserve to be. Happily married and living a life that every day I thank God for being here. And that's a bit of a contradiction and hard for some folks, and in fact for me to appreciate from time to time, considering that gauntlet that you've talked about.
Yeah, and I think it's also important too, and you kind of allude to this, is like, it's not about comparison, right? So like you're going to share part of your story. It's there's nuances to it, right? And but the grief that you're experiencing is your grief, and it's real, and we don't want to get into the habit of comparing pain. So, well, and I think that you kind of talk about that as a way to get to joy, as understanding kind of who you are and what that means and looks like. So if you're listening and you're experiencing grief, I think Mark and I both agree that we just want to validate that grief and listen for the nuances on how to survive and stay alive and then thrive.
Yeah, I mean, that's well said. I mean, I can tell you, as I'm going to share, grief is real, and it is in many cases overwhelming and heartbreaking, and it completely turns your life upside down. And there's not just one way. It's not because you lost somebody that you love that's the definition of grief. People are hurting through divorce, through financial catastrophe, losing businesses, struggling with mental health issues.
Right.
In this era of COVID, I mean, gosh, how many people are struggling with isolation and not being able to connect and have community with those that they love? That there's, and of course, being diagnosed with serious illness and other challenges are just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, WebMD did a survey in 2019 and found that 71% of Americans responded that they had been impacted by a loss event in their life that they were still struggling with over the previous 3 years.
Oh, wow.
So if you take 71% times 300 million Americans, that's 200 million of us just in America. So, we have this sense that
and that's pre-COVID, right? Like, that's not even counting what we've all been through, the trauma that we've all been through the last year.
Oh, that's a great point. And, ultimately, we tend to, when we're stuck in these situations, many of us will isolate or kind of circle the wagons, if you will. And ultimately, you are not alone in this journey. Not only are there a couple of other people that can relate to what you're experiencing, but there's tens, hundreds of millions of us, and that's just in this United States. So, I want to encourage you, if you're going through this, to, listen a little bit to what we're talking about here today, and, embrace the fact that this is a tough experience, and it's true and it's valid, but, we have hope that you can navigate your way through this and find yourself living a happy and then joy-filled life. As you'll hear my story, if I can do it, I promise you that you can do it.
And this is actually a great place to mention your podcasts, because your podcast is really focusing on that joy-filled life, right? Like, what's the name of it, so that I know my listeners are going to want to subscribe to it? What's the name of the podcast?
Well, it's Survive, Alive, Thrive, which is the name of my book and the nonprofit entity. So it's Survive, Alive, Thrive, and it's navigating the journey from loss to a joy-filled life. And on it, I'm privileged to interview folks who have gone through really tough stuff, who share their stories, many people who are well-known, of their loss and brokenness. And it can be from the loss of a child, a spouse, a parent, or a dear friend or sibling. It can be fighting drug addiction and alcoholism and finding their way through that challenge. But ultimately, it's a great reminder that when God is at the center of our journey, that there is the potential to find joy and happiness again. And we hope to walk you through those examples.
No, I love that. And I love that because you're coming from such an authentic place. So let's kind of jump into your story. Where is the best place to jump in so that we can appreciate where you've been and have a deeper understanding about where you are now? Because I think it's the journey that we're going to get a lot of growth out of.
Well, I appreciate that. So, there's a lot of different ways to tell my story. I think I'm going to start in 2015. I was passing a kidney stone, which sadly I've gone through. And for those of you who have been through this, that is no fun.
Multiple times. It's the worst in the world.
Oh my God. And this too will pass is true, but while you're in it, oh my gosh, it is tough. So I was going through this, and it was the 12th one or so that I had passed. And the urologist said, look, there's some chems here that I don't like, and brought me back in. Said, the more we look at this, I'm concerned. I want to do a comprehensive biopsy. They did a 12-point biopsy on my prostate, sent it out through Johns Hopkins, called me back 3 days later and said I needed to come in to talk to the doctor. And the prophetic words, and you have to bring your wife.
Oh, geez.
I'm just telling you, that's usually not good news. So we go in, and he looks me in the eye and says, look, I don't know. There's no easy way to say this, but that you have a pretty significant advanced case of prostate cancer, and we're going to need to take some steps to make sure it either hasn't already or it will not metastasize to other organs. Well, that's not news that is easy to take. I mean, there's a lot of different ways when the doctor's looking you eye to eye and says the word cancer that transcends this idea that I understand what cancer is, and I've heard other people, but you're talking about me. And as he went on and said, I don't think this will kill you. I think that we're going to, and I'm thinking, kill me. I mean, I was running 5 miles.
I didn't even know that was on the table.
I'm running 5 miles 3 days a week. I'm in excellent shape. I mean, I'm feeling like, what are you talking about? Who's talking about killing me? And of course, my wife digs right into the literature, and he's recommending either a radical surgery, a chemotherapy, or these radiation seed, implants as various options. And he gives us a week to review the options and get back to him. So, I walk out of there a little shell-shocked, right? And go through the experience. And we agree, this was on a Thursday, that a week later on a Friday, we're going to have a discussion about which of these 3 options that he's recommending is the best solution. So, as I mentioned earlier, I circle the wagons. I tell my sister, who's a physician, and her husband, who's also a doctor, and my brother, and maybe 3 or 4 of my closest friends. And I instruct my wife, Victoria, do not tell anybody about this, right? Which she looked at me like, well, don't we want a big, prayer chain to get started? I'm like, this is private. This is my information. And I've learned later that that's a fairly common reaction, right? I mean, it's not, in my experience, in retrospect, the right decision, but it was just kind of a circle the wagons sort of a feeling. Well, about 3 or 4 days later, a friend of mine calls and says, listen, my wife, Sarah, who had told about this, he was one of my dear close circle of friends. Sarah had been on a prayer walk, and she had something to tell me. I said, oh, wow. Okay. So he puts her on speaker on his car phone, and she says, Mark, I've been on a prayer walk, and God has told me you will be healed.
Come on.
So I'm saying, okay, well, that's great.
I'm here for that, right?
Did he say how or when? And she's like, no, I had this distinct message as I was praying for you. He says, Mark will be healed. And I just wanted you to know that. I wanted to encourage you. And I was like, great, thanks. What do you do with that information? So I go home and tell my wife, and Victoria's like, how? Of course, she's very, let's very concrete about this. And ultimately, we get Sarah back on the phone because Victoria's got questions. She's like, well, did God say chemo or seeds or surgery? And Sarah was kind of laughing, no, he just said Mark would be healed. And after a 15, 20-minute discussion and thanking them because they're dear friends, we hang up and Victoria looks at me and she goes, radiation seeds are the way to go. I know somebody who did it. We're all good. That's great. And walks away. And I thought, wow, this is overwhelming stuff to try to process, right? So ultimately, it's Thursday now, the night before Friday's phone call with the doctor. And Friday morning, I have a board meeting. So we have set a call at 2:00 to have the call. And we go to sleep. And at 4 a.m, I'm restless. And I'm kind of restless. And I'm in that a little bit awake stage and kind of lying down, but looking around the room, wondering, what am I going to do? And so here's one of these unusual moments, the most unusual moment, arguably, in my life. And that is a audible voice, what I consider to be the voice of God, Holy Spirit, not sure how to define it, says to me, you will be healed, and then I will reveal your commission.
Wow.
So, I'd like to think I'm not a kook. So I sit up in bed and I'm running through my mind like, whoa, the pressure is getting to me. Maybe that was like a residual component of my dream.
Yeah.
And I swing my feet around and put them on the floor. I'm kind of sitting on the side of the bed, right? I take a sip of water from the glass on the nighttime table next to our bed. And again, the voice says very clearly, almost like a field of dreams, sort of ethereal type of voice, you will be healed, and then I will reveal your commission.
Wow.
So I stand up, and what do? I go to the alarm panel on the master bed, because I'm like, are the doors open? Has somebody opened the window? It's May of 2015. And of course, everything's locked up tight. It's 4 a.m. There's not a sound in the neighborhood or anywhere. We're in suburban Connecticut, at the end of a long driveway. I throw water on my face, pace, grab my journal, write, furiously, go into the office, my home office. And, I pray, I pace, I'm like, okay, it's 5:30. Sure. I've got to get up at 7 for a board meeting. I go back to bed. 7:00, the alarm goes off. I get up, take my shower, put on my little suit, getting ready to go to work. And suddenly I have this overwhelming desire to read the book of Acts. Now, do you remember Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when Richard Dreyfuss is like overwhelmed with this desire to go to the mountain? He's making mashed potato, things in his life.
Yeah.
So it wasn't quite as kooky as that, but it was, I need to read the book of Acts. So I text my CEO and say, something's come up. I might be late. Now, I was running the revenue side of this business, and I was first up presenting the revenue to the board. So here it is, 7:30, and I'm texting him, I'm going to be a little late. And of course, it took 1.4 seconds for him to respond to my text. Like, what are you talking about? You're on first. I said, well, can you rearrange it? He goes, is everything okay? And I said, something's come up. I didn't know what to say. I hadn't even told him that I'd been diagnosed with cancer. So I start reading the book of Acts. And as many of our listeners know, it's a long book, right? The journey.
Yeah. It's not short. It's not a like it's not a one, not usually a one-stop like reading adventure here.
And not only that, I'm not given any direction as far as I can tell of which chapter. So I just sit down at Bible Gateway, chapter 1, 3, 7. I look at my watch. It's like 8:15. I'm like, oh my gosh. And I'm reading it because I'm like, God has spoken to me. That doesn't happen every day.
Sure.
I've got to keep doing this. And 8:30, I'm on chapter 15. It's getting closer to 9. I'm at 18. I text him. I'm trying 9:30 or 10 o'clock, and I'm getting question mark back on my text. Like, really? So I get to chapter 20. And this is when Paul is returning Jerusalem. And he'll inevitably be arrested, but his church plant friends and partners in modern day Turkey trying to talk him out of going back. And they're like, no, they're plotting. They're waiting for you. And chapter 20, verse 23, he says, although I know that hardship and even prison await me, my life means nothing to me. The only thing that matters is to finish the race. And that race is to testify to the grace of God through Jesus Christ. And it's kind of like, okay, hold on a minute. This is the point. And I read it again. And I'm thinking, okay, I think I get it, that my commission will be to testify to the grace of God through Christ. I got it. So I get down on my knees, again, in my own little home office. And I'm thinking, wouldn't this be great if it was a Charlton Heston moment, right?
Right.
Shouldn't I say something like, thou art blessed me with, but that's not how I pray or I'm just like, so God, is this like the deal? This is, you're saying,
are we doing this?
You're going to heal me. And then I testify to your grace. And it was kind of like a little ethereal pat in the head that said, okay, you got to get to work.
Now, wait, well, how would you describe your faith prior to this moment? Were you, were you actively following Jesus? Were you like, because I think a lot of people identify as Christian, but don't really have like the most in-depth faith life. Where were you on the scale of connection to Christ prior to this, pat on the head?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. So I was raised as a kid, an Episcopalian in the suburbs of Chicago, and walked away from any form of religion when I was about 13. And, I felt that religion, it had all kinds of problems that I couldn't wrap my arms around.
Sure.
And it took me until a pretty amazing event happened in my early 40s in 1999, when a neighbor brought me into a discussion about the difference between religion and a relationship with God, a friendship with God. And in my book, Survive, Alive, Thrive, there's a chapter that says, wait, what? God is my friend, right? This was a revolutionary thinking for me. It's like, no, I understand what religion is. And my friend Steve was able to guide me in that direction. Now, to be fair, I was successful in the world, had achieved some success in the sales and the media, related business. But when Steve and I had this conversation, he said, are you happy? And my desire was to say, in fact, I did say, yes, I'm happy. I'm incredibly happy. And,
sure.
The fact is I wasn't, and I knew it. And I was trying to overcompensate for that. There was a hole that money and toys and trips and vacations and houses, none of this was making me what I would call happy. Right. And my wife and I spoke about that, and she said, I don't know if we are happy. Right. What do we want from life? Our son was 3 years old. And that led me down this journey to reassess and understand, God. And the writings of C.S. Lewis and Mere Christianity, the book is so,
that's a great book. Yeah.
Profoundly simple, right? But God's grace is so different than any other worldview that's out there. A God who has suffered like we have and loves us unconditionally no matter what, which is a really important foundational piece for grief, by the way, right? If you've gone through tough stuff, so is he.
So you kind of get to this place where God's giving you the pat on the head, right? And you've grown in your faith over the last several years. And so do you go to the meeting?
Well, I go to the meeting. I go to the meeting at work, and things go fine. And at 2:00, I get the phone call from the doctor, and he's saying, "How are you doing? I know it's been a tough week, and have you made a decision?" And I said, and his words were, "So what are we doing?" And it was kind of an interesting word choice. And I said, "Well, I don't think I'm going to do anything." There's a little bit of a pause on the phone. And he's like, "Okay." Probably thinking to himself, poor word choice. He goes, "I don't mean today. I just mean, have you decided on the three options that I've spelled out?" And I said, "Yeah, no, I understood what you meant. I'm thinking healing." Mm-hmm. Now there's a little longer pause, and he might have said just what you did. And he comes back and he's like, "Okay, so like homeopathic or naturopathic, or are you thinking like some European?" And I'm like getting boxed into a corner. I can't think of an excuse or a way to say this.
So I love the awkwardness of this conversation, by the way.
I'm like, no, I'm thinking God. Now there's a long pause on the other side, and the doctor's a good guy, but he comes back. He's like, "Mark, listen, I know this has been a stressful week. This is a serious decision. Why don't you come in and bring Victoria on Monday, and we'll have a more serious conversation about it." So we go in, and of course I get home and have to walk through this with my wife, who is skeptical, I would say, at the very least, but on the other hand, believes and trusts God and wants, me to be faithful to my convictions and to my relationship with God. So we have this decision to make, and we decide we're going to stick to what I believe is the truth, which was to allow God to heal me. So 7 months later, it's November, and the organization, the hospital organization and practice calls and says, "I have to come in. I've refused treatment." And, we've been taking blood tests and so forth to monitor various things. And they say I have to sign a waiver releasing them from responsibility because they've recommended that I do this and that. So, and I'm refusing it. So I go in, I agree to sign it, and Victoria goes with me, and she's a wreck. And as we get there, I'm like, "Look, what other choice do I have?" He says, "Well, what we could do is do a second biopsy, comprehensive 12-point. And then we can also see if there's any evidence of metastasization, if it's moved to other organs." So I agree. And it's not a fun procedure. I've just got to tell you, but but at the end of the day, and frequently it's recommended you shouldn't do 2 biopsies in a year because it can actually initiate metastasization the more you probe. So anyway, I agree to it. 3 days later, he calls and he asked to get my wife on the line again, which had me a little bit curious.
Yeah.
And he says, "Okay, I just want to hear from both of you. Have you been seeing another doctor?" And I said, "No." He said, "Treatments?" I said, "No." And he's like, "Well, look," he goes, "this is the darndest thing. I can't explain this, but there is no cancer present."
Won't he do it?
Amen. My wife cries. I'm like, "Yes." He goes, "I can't explain it. I don't understand it." I go, "I can explain it. God promised me this. I told you this."
Right.
And he's like, "Well, I think we need to do some more tests." And I'm like, "No, we don't."
No, I'm good, man. I'm all set here.
Totally right. So ultimately, that was the story. And I'm on the way. I was involved after my coming to know Jesus personally in 1999. Got very involved in in men's ministry and talking to men in the marketplace, not necessarily Bible study, but more along the lines of what difference does a relationship with God make, and was very involved in a organization called New Canaan Society. I lived in New Canaan, Connecticut, and involved in leadership there in the early stages of the organization. And today it's a wonderful, large national organization that serves men in the marketplace. But this was a passion of mine, and I was going to a regional retreat, and the founder of that organization is a dear friend of mine, and he and I talked about what I'd just been through, and he said, "You've got to tell your testimony." So I went up before the keynote and shared my testimony about cancer, and invited other men who were at the event, a couple hundred people there, to share their experience if they've been keeping this to themselves. And after a few awkward moments, a guy stood up, and then another 12 people stood up sharing their experiences, what they were currently being diagnosed with and kept to themselves, or a family member, or it was really amazing. And I thought, this is it, man. I'm living my commission. I've been healed of cancer.
Right, yeah.
How great is this? This is the most wonderful deal ever. I'm so glad I made that agreement with God back in my office. But you know what? That was not what my journey was going to be about. So there's another chapter.
How did you live in that moment from, okay, trusting God with the promise of your healing to actually being healed? Because I think there are a lot of people who are listening right now who are in that period of trust, surrender, and wait. Right. And I would say that, as being the successful business owner that you are, and successful in the marketplace, like, I think you probably have a lot of the same tendencies that I do, which is, I want to be in control.
Right.
Talk to me about that space in the middle.
Well, in that context, I had surrendered my life and trust, and I have, like a lot of men and women, particularly Type A folks, like to build things, or I have control related issues. Right?
Yeah, so, amen. Right here. I mean, you're talking to him. Like, I'm all for that.
So it's a great question. But to me, my worldview had my faith had driven me to understand that God's in charge and He's got everything. And in the end, I trust Him. So, surprisingly, it was not very anxious, right? I mean, I frankly rarely thought about it, right? Unless we had one of our biweekly or then, monthly meetings with the urologist. It was like, oh yeah, that's coming up next week. I wonder how I'm doing. But, I was busy. I continued to, stay physically active and exercise. I felt fine, right? Yeah. I didn't feel like I was sick or losing energy, but I was aware of it deep back, and probably prayed more about asking for trust and peace, right? That Philippians talks about in Philippians chapter 4, verse 6, he talks about a peace that surpasses all understanding when you ask Him with a thanks-filled heart to help you through things that you're struggling with. And I think I may have been, either I was in denial or I was in living the blessing of the peace of God,
of the peace, right? Yeah.
Helping me through it. But obviously that kind of unraveled when I got the call about writing the signing the release form. So it
obviously changed your relationship with God. Did it change the relationship with anybody else in your life?
Yes. Ultimately, I think my wife and I were aware of this sort of diagnosis. What I've been interviewing for the last 5 years now, people who have gone through experiences like this and the rest of the story that I'm going to share with you. And I find that there's a blessing that happens interpersonally, or that can happen interpersonally, where people recognize their mortality and the gift that we have of life here together. And you tend to, there's a great song by Tim McGraw, which is "Live Like You Were Dying."
Oh yeah, I know it well.
Yeah, love that song. And so what did you do? And his lyrics are, I went skydiving, went Rocky Mountain hiking, did 2.7 seconds on a bull named Fu Manchu or something like that. But, he lived his life. And we found a lot of blessings in that time frame. But again, I mean, honestly, we didn't dwell on it. We were focused on life and trust and aware that sooner or later we'll find out what his plan was. So it was revealed to me that I could trust him. It turned out that he chose, his will was to heal my cancer, which was not necessarily a sure thing. It was not necessarily what's going to happen to anybody else who goes through that experience. But he had a reason for doing that, and I wasn't sure what it was, although as I'm talking to people and about my experience and seeing folks find encouragement through that, I really thought that was the primary story, but it wasn't. 6 months later, actually, I'm going to back up a little bit. In 2010, I was in a management meeting at a different company, and I got a phone call and ignored it a few times. The third time it called from a number I didn't recognize. Within literally 60 seconds, I finally answered it. And it was a paramedic who told me he was in the ambulance with my wife on the way to the hospital. She'd been in a high-speed car accident, and they thought she was going to make it through, but I needed to get to the hospital.
Wow.
Now, that is also a call that you don't prepare yourself for, whether it's a kid or a sibling or parent, and certainly your spouse. So I rushed to the hospital, and Victoria made it through. But she had significant neurological damage to her neck and head.
Trauma, yeah, I bet.
She'd been in an accident with a landscape truck, one of these big trucks that have a cage in the back that carry lawnmowers and that sort of stuff. And it was serious. Our SUV Land Rover was smashed in ways that I could not imagine. But she made it through, and the trauma that she suffered had left her with some debilitating pain and symptoms that we couldn't figure out, no matter how many neurologists and internists and so forth that we met. And it was really frustrating for her. And folks who have lived with this pain or chronic pain understand some of this journey. And it, over time, spiraled into a depression. And in 2012, that depression went from a minor struggle to a break, a delusional break. And she was struggling with paranoid, delusional thinking. We got her into a care with a psychologist, psychiatrist, and a terrific Christian caring group. And over the next couple of years, experimenting with medication, we were able to get her back a good 80% of where she was. So she didn't feel like a zombie, but she was able to also not be struggling with these issues. And the neurological stuff was still present. So, it was a super hard time. And people who have been through this, I just want to express my compassion, having been through this myself. When you have a person in your family who struggles with mental illness, mental health issues, depression, et cetera, it's not as heartbreaking it is for that person. It's not just them. This is a family thing. Your your spouse, your parents, your kids, your friends. It is heartbreaking and difficult, and of course our hearts are in it for those who are struggling, but boy, it's tough, right? Our son was, 16 when she was in the car accident, and he watched his mom go from this incredibly, bright, talented, um, vivacious manager of his and our lives, to struggling every day with the pain and emotional challenges that went with her condition. And it is heartbreaking, for everybody involved. But the good news is that the medication worked. And I would also say, for people who've been through this, it's not like take the blue pill or the red pill and see which one that works, right?
It really is much more of an art, isn't it?
And it's trial and error, because somebody who might be diagnosed with one form of mental illness may respond to some combination of pills, where another person with the exact same diagnosis doesn't. So you're really experimenting with multiple solutions and our body chemistries, and it's tough. But we found an answer, thankfully, and now we get through my cancer experience, and we're thinking this is great. Our son, who has dyslexia and significant learning disabilities, but who's a really smart young man, is going to a high school that specializes in teaching kids with these challenges. And he was doing well, had actually scholarship offers to run cross country in college.
Oh, that's awesome.
And it was just a wonderful accomplishment. Scheduled a big party with about 30 people, family members and close friends, to have a manhood tribute to Anderson, celebrating and toasting him on his way to college. And a little more than a month before then, Victoria decides that she wants to lose the weight that the medication is causing, and decides that she's going to go off medication.
Wow.
Well, now you're no longer under doctor's control as she was when she had her break, because it had been several years. So she's making her own decisions. And again, in the mental health arena, another very common thing people go through is that the person who's struggling with it takes medication, feels better, and then feels better and says, I don't need it anymore.
Yeah.
And then they go back down, and then they take it again, and then they feel better, and I don't need it anymore. But in this case, it's completely fair to understand that the medications do typically put weight on the user. And so she decided that was it. I mean, obviously I was deeply concerned about that, but my job was to support and love her and try to be a sounding board. And as the next 5 weeks went down, she started to spiral again. And by the time we got to his weekend, she was struggling in what was clearly like dark eyes again. And we got back from that weekend, that big celebration, and spent the Monday planning Anderson's, my son's name is Anderson, planning his the college choice, which of the scholarship offers he was going to take. And the next day went for a run. Anderson went for a training run. Then I went to hit some golf balls. And on the way back home, I sensed something was wrong. Anderson didn't think his mom was home. And the long and short of it is, as I pulled into our home that evening around 5 o'clock, I pulled into the garage to find that she had taken her life.
I'm so sorry.
She was in the garage, had hung herself with a ski rope, and it was a traumatic and horrible situation. My son heard me yell in the in the garage, came running through the door and found me trying to get his mom's body down. And
Yeah.
I mean, just stuff that you can't imagine. By the time we called 911, by the time the paramedics and police showed up, they moved me away, and I was crawling on my hands and knees like a wounded animal on the floor. And
Wow.
I mean, literally in shock and in, agony, right? Emotional brokenness. And a policeman showed mercy and, took my arm and lifted me up and walked me into the home. And then it started, right?
Yeah.
Now what? And that time frame, what I call the survive stage of loss, is wrought with unimaginable challenges, both emotionally and strategically, right? So,
Yeah.
Fast forward to 10 days later, I had spent the next week walking the park about 3 or 4 in the morning. I just couldn't sleep. Images would pop in my head. My sister and brother had come from Nashville. I was in Connecticut at the time and stayed with me for 2 weeks. Heroic support moves by them for which I will always be grateful and in debt. And
Amen. Yeah.
fortunate to have close relationships with my siblings, but this was amazing. Friends and the community, rallied around, but it's overwhelming. And I just needed to go to the park alone and talk to God and
Sure.
and ask for answers and pray and cry. And it was a really dark time, but through it, although the park was completely vacant at 3:30 in the morning in Connecticut in May, I wasn't alone, right?
Yeah.
I kept getting this message that I'm greater than that. So I started bringing a notebook with me about the second or third day, and I'd walk around and I'd say greater than that. And I kept writing it. I have like 4 pages. It just says greater than that, greater than that, greater than that. And then I start filling it in, greater than mental health, greater than cancer, greater than suicide, greater than, greater than anything, greater than life, greater than death. I mean, so I forge a eulogy for Victoria that is entitled Greater Than That.
Wow.
After the 3 eulogies that preceded from 2 close friends and one of her brothers, I gave the Greater Than That eulogy. And it was about God is greater than all of the things I just mentioned. And we're not going to let the enemy further victimize us. We're not going to let the enemy put shame on us through this event. We're going to not focus on Victoria's death. We're going to talk about the way she lived life and the fact that the greatest day of her life was meeting Jesus Christ and being embraced by his arms. And while that might have been the worst day of my life, as the song from Mercy Me, I can only imagine, first in his presence. I mean, this is what we chose to focus on and think about. And following that event, we had hundreds of people attend this event. Victoria was well loved. And I started getting texts and calls and emails and dozens of them. And they almost every single one of them said, thank you for testifying to the grace of God in Jesus Christ.
Praise God.
And I was reading these things and I started saying to my brother, look at this. And this one says this, and we started highlighting them. And we were like, you know what? The intervention that I had experienced with God's offering to heal my cancer and reveal my commission, which was Acts 20, verse 23, which was to agree to testify to the grace of God through Christ, had nothing to do, or had something to do maybe, but with my cancer. But it was really about preparing me for what I was going to experience a year later, and using that experience to help people go through really incredibly tough stuff, I've just shared with you.
I love that. Like Romans 8:28 comes to mind, like all things work together for his good, right? And while
Right.
I certainly don't ever think that God wants those things to happen, man, we serve a redeeming God. And I just love that.
Right on. Well, thanks for that encouragement. And, I started speaking on this. I went to the same conference the next year, and they asked me to share the story. And it was really interesting, from one year of talking about being healed of cancer to another suffering the loss of my wife in such a tragic way. The point was, my understanding, my trust in God was not contingent on whether I was getting good news or whether I was struggling through something really tough. And as a result of that discussion, I was asked to speak some other places, and a publisher approached me and said, "Boy, I really want to tell your story in a book. Can we publish a book about your story?" And I was given some advice. I mean, I said, "Sure, that'd be great."
Yeah, right.
Awesome, right. And I talked to a friend about this, who's kind of mentoring, impactful sort of a guy in my life. And he said, "I don't think that's what you should be doing right now." And I was kind of like, "What?" The guy offered me a book opportunity. What are you talking about? And he goes,
Right.
"I think it's bigger than just your story, man. I don't think God wouldn't do this just so you would tell your story." And I said, "Well, how long do you think I should take?" And he goes, "I don't think you're going to like that answer." I said, "No, really?
Just
How
so
long?"
you know, I hate friends like this.
He's like,
Truth
"Well,
tellers.
you're asking." He says, "I think about 4 years."
Oh, wow.
I was like, 4 years? I just looked at him like, I don't remember the character. He said, "Well, you must have lost your mind." I thought, 4 years. So, I turned down that book opportunity, and I started on this journey of interviewing people who had been through their own experiences of loss and challenge, folks who were terminally ill,
Yeah.
folks who had lost people through the midnight call, right? Or through the long, hard road of battling the an illness that eventually took their loved one. The experience of ongoing struggle and hardship, battling mental health issues with somebody that they love. And I found that not only, and by the way, I got counseling following, my experience from a guy who specialized in trauma counseling, had been a fireman counselor during the 9/11 bombing. And, he and I we did some good work together. He was really a great blessing for me. So what we're doing with Survive Alive Thrive is part of it, right? But if you've been through this, getting a counselor, and we talk about this in my book, how to find one and identify one and the challenges associated with that. But along with counseling and processing and so forth, I started interviewing people because I had read a book by someone that you have interviewed recently on your podcast, Dr. Kurt Thompson. And the book was called Anatomy of the Soul.
Yeah.
And he had referred to this guy, a psych professor at UCLA named Dan Siegel, who was pioneering this research on the idea that the act of sharing actually stimulates healing that he could measure on a neurobiologically, scientifically supported manner. And I thought,
I love that.
Wow, that's amazing. So I started reading that. I started reading his work, and it ties in beautifully. Obviously, group support meetings and so forth are about sharing, right? In fact, the very act of getting counseling is sharing and working through. But
That's part of the reason why I love podcasts so much. There's such a healing idea to this, just people sharing.
Oh, that's such a great point. And you're engaging as a healer yourself by providing that opportunity. Every time I share my story, I experience healing that is, according to Dr. Siegel, measurable, neurobiologically improvable. Yeah. So, what a wonderful gift that you're providing, in this process. And imagine those out there who say, well, I don't want to tell my story. And I've interviewed them and I say, well, how about if you think about there's somebody out there who's going through what you've been through and that your story can help them, encourage them. 100% say, oh, all right, well, then I will do it if it'll help somebody. Wow. I mean, that's the beauty of who we are as God's children, right? I don't want to talk about myself. Well, what if you can help somebody? I can help somebody, I'm in, right? There's a quote that I love from Billy Graham, the great Billy Graham. And it starts one of the final chapters in my book. And that quote is, the sufferer becomes the comforter in the service of the Lord.
Ooh, that's good. Say that one more time.
The sufferer becomes the comforter in the service of the Lord. Now think about that. Jesus Christ suffered on our behalf, right? Think about what he went through. I mean, stuff that is just really hard to imagine. And, you can watch the movie, The Passion of the Christ, to get an idea of that. But the point being, suffering in ways that we can only imagine. And who do we as Christians turn to for comfort? The sufferer, who's now the comforter. So when we are engaging in a life that is to honor and reflect what he has modeled for us, the only God idea in the history of religion, that actually suffered himself for us and offers us comfort, having walked that same journey. Now you, as someone who's gone through suffering, have the opportunity to engage in that same role and comfort others. Isn't that beautiful?
It's so beautiful. And it seems so simple, but yet just not something that we very often think about, that sharing is healing and healing is sharing. And there's kind of this weird kind of, dynamic connection between the two. And I love the way you bring that out. That's powerful stuff.
Yeah, well, thank you for that encouragement. And I'm telling you, I've been so encouraged with the folks that I've talked to. And part of that process revealed that grief processing, the journey, the traditional steps of grieving don't apply. I couldn't relate to them. And of the hundreds of people that I've interviewed over the last, several years, not a single one said, oh yeah, those 5 stages really make sense to me. Right.
I'm in step 3, right. Right.
And by the way, those are built on this groundbreaking work by Swiss psychologist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969, 50 years ago. And it was called the 5 stages of grief. And they are denial. Denial, anger, depression, negotiation, bargaining, and acceptance. And there's singular emotional stages that you progress to acceptance and healing. And it just doesn't make sense. So I did more research on that after a couple of years, and I found, you know what? It wasn't even intended for those of us who have experienced loss. In fact, It was written, if you go back to her work, it's written specifically for people who have been diagnosed with a terminal illness and had 3 to 6 months to live. That was the whole research.
No kidding. And we just kind of misinterpreted it all these years.
Well, it's been...
it's been massaged, right?
It's been massaged and spun, and maybe it doesn't go in this order. Maybe there's 7 of them or whatever.
Yeah.
Survive, Alive, Thrive completely reimagines and reframes and remodels that into the 3 stages. Survive in close proximity to your loss, when you're literally just trying to get through 1 hour, day, or week.
Those are those 3 a.m. walks in the park.
Bingo. And then you transition to the alive stage, where you have to live your life. And you got to pay your bills and your kids got to go to school. My son had to go to college.
Right.
It's only 3 months later, right? But your heart is not healed. You're still suffering brokenness and pain, but you have to be alive. How do you balance that and find healing through that process? And then the third is when you've achieved a sense of re-experiencing joy and happiness in your life, right? And yet your loss will always be a part of who you are. It's these experiences are woven into the fabric of our journey, right?
Yeah.
We are, they'll always be a part of us. Not, I hit the fifth stage and it's over. I feel
right.
It's done.
It's not the magic. It's not the magic wand, right? It's just not going to go away.
No way. And then further, what Survive Alive Thrive shares is that in each stage, the experience is atomic in nature. This is a new model idea. And atomic means there are many, many emotions and life tasks and feelings and experiences that are all swirling around within that stage. It's not a singular emotion, right? There's many, many things: guilt, grief, happiness that she went to heaven, sadness she's not here, loneliness,
right? Yeah.
Anger. How could this abandon? I mean, there's all these things. Some are positive and some are painful, but it's not one, it's many. Now imagine each of those emotions as a ping pong ball. And let's just say there's 10 of them. If you put them in a goldfish bowl and shake that goldfish bowl, they're going to be banging into each other constantly, right? This is the compressed stage.
Of course, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Now you move and you get a little more emotional elbow room. Those 10 ping pong balls are now in more of a life stage that's as big as those storage pods in front of your house. So if you could pick that up and shake it, they'll still bang into each other, but less frequently than a little goldfish bowl. And even in alive, right? Even in the alive stage, you're living life and it's great. But now those 10 emotional dynamics that are part of your loss experience are in a container like a hot air balloon. And if you shake that big old thing, every now and then they might bump into each other. And think about this metaphorically, like on an anniversary, holiday, or when you run into a picture.
Oh, Mark, that's so good.
You know, it's going to happen. It doesn't go away. Whereas a linear progression of singular emotions, suddenly 10 years later, you cry when you, and by the way, I'm one of these guys who cries, right?
Me too. Yeah.
You see a picture or you tell a story or someone remembers an event and it's touching and poignant and you cry. Could be tears of joy, could be tears of sadness. Does that mean, oh my gosh, I've regressed, I'm all the way back on stage one? No.
Yeah.
It just means that a couple of those ping pong emotional balls collided and you're still okay. So this book is about helping people navigate the process, understanding where they are and how to take healthy steps to get to the point where they're thriving and giving back.
I just love it. I love the image of the ping pong balls because every new relationship adds another ball into the equation, right? And if you think about a hot air balloon, even though you're in Thrive, right, and everything's great, sometimes that ping pong ball with your son, who is wonderful and awesome, like still bangs up against that kind of that old ball that just is never going to go away. But ideally, maybe we're just giving it a little bit more space to bounce around.
So true. And that's well said. And for each of us, our ping pong balls are different, right?
Yeah,
my life story and background is different than yours and that of our listeners. So there's not one, it's not a one emotional reaction fits all. It's complicated. It's atomic, right? It's like that swirling atomic symbol that you've seen with neutrons and protons and all that stuff swirling around.
Oh man, I am so appreciative of your time today, Mark. And I'm praying for what God's going to do through this book and through your ministries. I know that my listeners are going to want to follow up for you. Where is the best place where they can get connected to the book and your podcast and your ministries? where is the best place to start to learn about you on the interwebs?
Well, I have founded a nonprofit organization, which is called survivealivethrive.org. And it is an organization intended to provide community and an opportunity to interact with others about your experiences in life, to give back by sharing your story, or if you're in the midst of your struggle, to find others that you can connect with and relate to. You can do it through the Zoom hosted support groups that our website provides, that you can enter either through a variety of different ways, through what you've been through, what stage you're in, et cetera. A lot of different groups that you can join, which is cool. But again, and the website is survive-alive-thrive.org. Survive Alive Thrive with dashes in between it.org. And you can reach me at mark@survivealivethrive.org. I try to respond to every email that I get. If you're interested in sharing your story, encouraging others, would love, to hear you and hear about your story. And most importantly, don't forget you're not alone, and that, you can find joy again, by centering on God's love and walking through some steps, and I hope in some small way the Survive Alive Thrive book and nonprofit entity can help you on your journey.
That's so good. Okay, last question we always love to ask. It's an advice question, right? Where you give yourself a piece of advice. And I'm going to take you to the day that you got the call that your life was going to be changed because of cancer, right? And so you get the call from your doctor. Now, let's go back in time and say you could talk to the version of yourself, that young version of Mark, before you're about to pick up the phone and the doctor's going to say, hey, I need you and Victoria to come in. What's the one piece of advice you'd give yourself?
Boy, that's a great question. Question. The advice that I would give myself at that moment would be lean on your faith and trust that everything will work out according to his plan.
Amen.
That would be it. Just
amen.
You have to trust. And it's hard to imagine that some of the worst days in our lives are actually super important and beautiful steps on the journey that God has, in mind for us. And it's super hard when you're there, particularly when you've lost somebody. But, I love your point about Romans 8:28, right? I mean, he promises that he can use everything you're going through for good if you live according to his purpose, right? And love him.
So good. Mark, thank you for being so vulnerable and generous with your time today. What an absolute blessing for me. And I know that a lot of our friends who are listening are just really appreciative. So on behalf of me and all of our community here at the Reclamation Podcast, thank you so much.
Thank you, man. Thank you for what you're doing.
So many great nuggets from that conversation with Mark. I know that his book, Survive, Alive, and Thrive, is going to be a huge blessing if you are navigating that journey from loss to life and what that looks like. And I know so many of us are. If that is you, I want you to know that I'm praying for you, and I know how hard those moments can be. So I hope this conversation was a blessing for you, whether you're navigating loss or not. I think it's relevant information for all of us, which is why I'm so happy to help facilitate this dialogue and that we can all be a part of it together. As always, 3 ways that you can help us. Leave a rating or review on iTunes, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and share this episode with a friend. That's how we get the word out. One person, one review, one rating at a time. Thankful for all you guys. And as always, I look forward to bringing you fresh new content every week. Thank you guys, and we'll connect real soon.